$50 million. Dead in the water, the pristine yacht sat lifeless in Milbrook Harbor, its silence mocking every expert who had tried and failed. Elena Whitmore stood rigid on the weathered dock, diamond earrings catching the morning sun, her ivory Chanel dress blazing against the salt-stained pier. Behind her, the final team of engineers wheeled their equipment cases toward black SUVs. 30 had tried, 30 had failed. Through the harbor mist emerged David, oil-streaked flannel hanging loose over faded jeans, his 6-year-old daughter Sophie bouncing beside him, clutching a carefully folded paper boat. The delicate creation slipped from her small fingers, landing in the murky puddle at Elena's feet. Without a glance downward, the woman's $1,000 heels crushed the soggy paper. David knelt slowly, his weathered hands gentle as he lifted the crumpled boat. "Can you fix boats?" Sophie asked innocently. "My daddy fixes everything." Elena's laugh cut through the salty air like shattered crystal. "If you're so smart, then fix my boat." 3 years had passed since Sarah's funeral, and David Mitchell still carried the weight of that final goodbye in his shoulders. The small coastal town of Milbrook had been their escape plan, a place where they would raise Sophie away from the chaos of Boston, where Sarah could paint the ocean views she'd always dreamed of. Instead, it became the place where David watched his wife fade away, where he'd traded his engineering career for the steady rhythm of fixing engines and broken carburetors. His garage sat just 2 blocks from the harbor, a converted warehouse where locals brought their pickup trucks and fishing boats for repairs. The smell of motor oil and sea salt had become his daily perfume, replacing the sterile scent of corporate conference rooms and blueprint paper. Elena Whitmore had arrived in Milbrook 3 weeks ago, fleeing a divorce that had painted her across every tabloid in New York. The Serenity, her $50 million yacht, was supposed to be her sanctuary, a floating palace where she could disappear from the world that had watched her marriage crumble. Her ex-husband had kept the Manhattan penthouse, the Hampton estate, even the private jet. But the yacht was hers, a wedding gift from happier times, and she'd sailed it to this quiet harbor thinking she could start over. The navigation system had failed on the second day, leaving her stranded in a town where her black credit card meant nothing if no one could fix the damn thing. Now, standing on the dock with grease-stained hands and a 6-year-old's unwavering faith in her father, David felt the familiar tug of a problem that begged to be solved. Elena's challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Sophie looked up at him with eyes that mirrored Sarah's, trusting, hopeful, certain that her daddy could work miracles. The yacht loomed behind Elena, its sleek lines and pristine white hull a stark contrast to the working boats bobbing nearby. David had spent 3 years convincing himself that he was content with small repairs, that the complicated world of marine engineering was behind him. But something about the way Elena's voice cracked just slightly on the word boat told him this was about more than just a broken navigation system. "I'll take a look," David said quietly, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. Elena's eyebrows shot up in surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to actually accept her sarcastic challenge. Sophie clapped her hands together, the soggy paper boat forgotten in her excitement. "Can I come too, Daddy? I want to see the big boat." David nodded, lifting her onto his shoulders as they approached the gangplank. Elena hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the yacht's entrance. "I should warn you," she said, her voice softer now. 30 engineers have looked at this thing. Marine specialists, electronics experts, even a team from the manufacturer. They all said the same thing. David paused at the gangplank, meeting her eyes directly. "What did they say?" "That it's impossible to fix." Elena led them through the yacht's main salon, her designer heels clicking against the polished hardwood floors. The interior was a masterpiece of modern luxury cream leather seating, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the harbor. Sophie's eyes widened as she took in the opulent surroundings, her small hands trailing along the silk wallpaper. "It's like a floating castle," she whispered, and for the first time since their encounter on the dock, Elena's expression softened. "It was supposed to be," she replied, her voice carrying a note of sadness that David recognized the sound of dreams deferred. The navigation center occupied the entire upper deck, a symphony of dark screens and silent electronics that should have been humming with life. David set Sophie down and approached the central console, his trained eye immediately cataloging the complexity of the system. Multiple radar displays, GPS units, autopilot controls, and communication equipment, all dark, all silent. He ran his fingers along the main control panel, noting the seamless integration of systems that would have required months of planning and installation. Tell me what happened, he said, not looking up from the controls. Elena moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that seemed out of place in the salty air. We were sailing from Martha's Vineyard, beautiful weather, perfect conditions. Then everything just died. No warning, no error messages, nothing, just complete system failure. Sophie had found a comfortable spot on the leather captain's chair, her legs swinging back and forth as she watched her father work. "Daddy, why are all the pretty lights turned off?" she asked, pointing to the array of indicators that should have been glowing green and blue. David glanced at Elena, who was studying him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Sometimes, sweetheart, when something complicated breaks, it's not really broken. It's just confused." He began checking connections, his movements methodical and precise. Years of troubleshooting had taught him that the most complex problems often had the simplest solutions: a loose wire, a blown fuse, a single component that had failed and taken everything else with it. "You know what you're doing," Elena observed, watching as David traced wiring harnesses with practiced efficiency. It wasn't a question. David's hands stilled for a moment, and when he looked up, his eyes held secrets that Elena was only beginning to suspect. "I know enough," he said simply, but there was something in his voice that suggested he knew far more than he was letting on. The first hour passed in comfortable silence, broken only by Sophie's occasional questions and Elena's growing fascination with watching David work. He moved through the yacht's systems with an intuitive understanding that went far beyond basic mechanical knowledge, checking not just the obvious components but the subtle interconnections that tied everything together. By noon, David had eliminated most of the common failure points, but the mystery only deepened. The power supplies were functioning perfectly, the main processors showed no signs of damage, and every individual component tested within normal parameters. It was as if the entire system had simply decided to stop communicating with itself. Elena brought sandwiches from the yacht's galley, and they ate in the salon while David explained his findings. "It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are there, but they're not talking to each other," he said, accepting a bottle of water from Elena. Sophie had curled up on the sofa, exhausted from the morning's excitement, her paper boat carefully placed on the coffee table beside her. "The other engineers said it would require completely rebuilding the entire system," Elena said, settling into the chair across from David. Cost estimate was over $2 million. David frowned, studying the technical documentation that Elena had retrieved from a locked cabinet. The yacht's electrical schematics were incredibly detailed, showing the work of designers who had spared no expense in creating a state-of-the-art navigation center. "They were thinking like engineers," he said finally. "Sometimes the best solution isn't the most complicated one." Elena leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" David was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to Sophie's sleeping form. "My wife used to say that I had a talent for seeing the forest instead of just the trees. Maybe that's what this needs." The afternoon brought a shift in their dynamic, as Elena found herself genuinely curious about the quiet man who had accepted her challenge. She made coffee in the yacht's galley, surprised by how natural it felt to play hostess to someone who seemed completely unimpressed by her wealth. David had removed his flannel shirt, revealing a plain white t-shirt that showed the lean muscle of someone who worked with his hands. His forearms bore small scars, the inevitable marks of a life spent fixing things, and Elena found herself wondering about the story behind each one. "You're not what I expected," she said, handing him a steaming mug. David looked up from the control panel he was examining, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who would be intimidated by all this." Elena gestured around the luxurious cabin. "Someone who would ask for payment up front, or want to know how much the yacht cost." David's smile widened slightly. Would it matter? The question hung between them, carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Elena realized that for the first time in months, she was talking to someone who seemed genuinely uninterested in her money, her status, or her very public personal disasters. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think it would." Sophie stirred on the sofa, blinking sleepily as she adjusted to the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "Daddy, did you fix the boat yet?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. David chuckled, reaching over to smooth her hair. "Not yet, sweetheart, but I'm getting close." As the sun began to set over Milbrook Harbor, David made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a secondary control panel, he found a small device that shouldn't have been there, a signal processor that had been added to the yacht's original configuration. The device was sophisticated, expensive, and completely unnecessary for normal navigation operations. "Elena," he called, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "You need to see this." She hurried over, Sophie trailing behind with renewed interest. David pointed to the device, his expression grim. This wasn't installed by the manufacturer. Someone added this after the fact, probably within the last few months. Elena's face paled as she studied the unmarked device. "What does it do?" "Near as I can tell, it's designed to interfere with the yacht's navigation systems, create false readings, disrupt communications, maybe even disable everything remotely." David's voice was steady, but Elena could hear the anger beneath his controlled tone. Someone wanted to make sure this yacht couldn't go anywhere. The implications hit Elena like a physical blow. Her ex-husband had been vindictive during the divorce, but she hadn't imagined he would go this far. "Can you remove it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded, already reaching for his tools. "Sophie, honey, can you hand me the small screwdriver from my toolkit?" The little girl scrambled to help, proud to be part of her father's work. Within minutes, David had carefully disconnected and removed the sabotage device. The yacht's navigation center came alive with a symphony of electronic sounds, beeps, chimes, and the gentle hum of processors initializing. Screens flickered to life, showing GPS coordinates, weather data, and the familiar glow of a functioning system. Elena stared at the displays in amazement, then turned to David with tears in her eyes. "How did you know to look for that? 30 engineers missed it completely." David was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the central console. "Because I've seen this kind of work before. I used to design marine navigation systems for a living, before." He trailed off, his eyes finding Sophie, who was watching the lights dance across the screens with wonder. "Before what?" Elena asked gently. David's voice was soft when he answered. "Before my wife got sick. Before I had to choose between my career and being there for her." The weight of his sacrifice settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Elena understood now why he had seemed so at home among the complex systems, why his movements had been so sure and practiced. "You gave it all up," she said, not really a question. David nodded, lifting Sophie back onto his shoulders. "And I'd do it again. Some things are more important than success." Elena watched them together, the devoted father and the daughter who believed he could fix anything, and felt something shift inside her chest. The engineers who looked at this system, they were looking for problems they understood. But you knew to look for something that wasn't supposed to be there. The harbor lights were beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness as they prepared to leave the yacht. Elena had tried to offer David payment, but he had refused, saying that seeing the system work again was reward enough. Sophie had convinced Elena to let her keep one of the yacht's small decorative flags, a blue pennant with a silver anchor that she clutched like a trophy. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Elena asked as they stood on the dock. David hesitated, and Elena could see the internal struggle in his expression. "I mean, to make sure everything's working properly. System checks, calibration, that sort of thing." It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. David looked down at Sophie, who was nodding enthusiastically. "I think that would be a good idea," he said finally. That night, Elena lay in the yacht's master suite, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the quiet man who had solved her impossible problem. The navigation screens glowed softly in the darkness, their gentle light a reminder that sometimes the most complex challenges required the simplest solutions. She thought about David's calloused hands, so gentle when he'd rescued Sophie's paper boat, so sure when he'd worked among the electronic systems. She thought about the sadness in his eyes when he'd mentioned his wife, and the way his entire face had softened when he'd looked at his daughter. For the first time in months, Elena felt something other than anger or desperation. She felt curious. David tucked Sophie into bed in their small apartment above the garage, listening to her excited chatter about the floating castle and the pretty lady with the sparkly earrings. "Daddy, why was the lady sad?" Sophie asked, her intuitive 6-year-old mind having picked up on Elena's underlying melancholy. David smoothed the blanket around his daughter's shoulders, considering his answer. "Sometimes, sweetheart, when people have a lot of things, they forget what's really important, and that can make them very lonely." Sophie nodded solemnly, processing this information. "Is that why you fixed her boat? To make her not lonely anymore?" David's breath caught slightly. "I fixed her boat because it was broken, and I knew how to fix it." Sophie's smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by his explanation, but she was too tired to argue. The next morning brought a surprise that changed the trajectory of both their lives. Elena appeared at David's garage just as he was opening for the day, carrying a cardboard tray with 3 coffee cups and a bag of fresh pastries from the town's bakery. She was dressed more casually than the day before, designer jeans and a silk blouse instead of the formal dress, but she still looked like she belonged in a different world. "I brought breakfast," she said, seeming almost shy. "I thought we could eat before we went to check the yacht." David accepted the offered coffee, noting that she had somehow remembered exactly how he liked it. "You didn't have to do this," he said, but he was smiling. Elena shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "I wanted to." Sophie burst through the door connecting the garage to their apartment, already dressed and ready for another adventure. "Elena, did you bring the sparkly boat?" Elena laughed, producing a small gift bag from her purse. "I brought you something even better." Inside the bag was a detailed model of a sailing yacht, complete with tiny rigging and miniature sails. Sophie gasped with delight, cradling the model like a precious treasure. "It's beautiful, thank you." She threw her arms around Elena's waist in an impulsive hug, and David watched Elena's expression transform from surprise to something approaching wonder. "You're very welcome, sweetheart," Elena said, her voice slightly hoarse with emotion. The walk to the harbor became a daily ritual over the next week. Elena would arrive each morning with coffee and pastries. David would perform unnecessary maintenance checks on the yacht's systems, and Sophie would explore every corner of the floating palace with increasing familiarity. Elena found herself looking forward to these mornings more than she had anticipated, charmed by Sophie's endless questions and David's quiet competence. She began to understand that David's reluctance to talk about his past wasn't just grief, it was the protective instinct of a man who had learned to measure his words carefully. "You know," she said one morning as they watched Sophie examine the yacht's compass, "I could use a permanent marine technician. Someone to maintain the systems, handle repairs, maybe even help with some upgrades I've been considering." David looked up from the control panel he was calibrating, his expression carefully neutral. "Elena, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not looking for charity." The words stung, and Elena felt her defenses rising. "It's not charity, it's a job offer. A legitimate position with a competitive salary and benefits." David's jaw tightened, and Elena realized she had touched a nerve. "I don't need to be rescued," he said quietly. "I chose this life. I chose to stay here, to raise Sophie in a place where she can be safe and happy. I don't need your world." The argument that followed was their first real conflict, conducted in hushed tones while Sophie played on the deck above them. Elena accused David of being stubborn and self-defeating. David accused Elena of trying to buy her way out of loneliness. The tension between them came to a head on a Thursday morning when Elena arrived at the garage to find David working on a rusty pickup truck instead of coming to the yacht. "You're avoiding me," she said, her voice flat. David didn't look up from the engine he was rebuilding. "I'm working. You know, that thing some of us do to pay the bills." Elena's temper flared. "Don't you dare talk to me about paying bills. I've seen your apartment, David. I've seen how you live. You could give Sophie so much more if you'd just accept help." The words hung in the air between them, cruel and accurate. David's hands stilled on his tools, and when he looked up, his eyes were filled with a pain that made Elena immediately regret her outburst. "You think I don't know that?" David's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 3 years of sacrifice and self-doubt. "You think I don't lie awake at night wondering if I'm failing her? If I'm being selfish by keeping us here instead of going back to Boston, taking a corporate job, giving her the kind of life Sarah would have wanted?" Elena felt tears prick her eyes, understanding too late that her words had cut deeper than she'd intended. "David, I didn't mean," he held up a hand, stopping her. "Yes, you did. And maybe you're right. Maybe I am being stubborn. Maybe I am letting my pride get in the way of what's best for Sophie." The admission cost him, and Elena could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Sophie chose that moment to appear in the doorway, her school backpack slung over her shoulder and her new sailing yacht model clutched in her hands. "Daddy, are you and Elena fighting?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. David knelt down to her level, his expression softening immediately. "We're just having a disagreement, sweetheart. Sometimes adults need to work things out." Sophie looked between them, her 6-year-old intuition picking up on the tension. "Are you still friends?" Elena stepped forward, her heart breaking at the worry in the little girl's voice. "Of course we are, Sophie. Your daddy and I just need to figure some things out." Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. Can we still go see the boat today? She asked hopefully. The yacht felt different that morning, the easy camaraderie of the past week replaced by careful politeness and unspoken tensions. Elena found herself watching David more closely, noticing the way he unconsciously rubbed his left shoulder, a nervous habit she was beginning to recognize. Sophie seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, staying closer to her father and speaking in quieter tones. The weather service is predicting a storm system moving in from the northeast, David reported, checking the yacht's meteorological displays. You might want to move to a more protected anchorage. Elena nodded, accepting the professional advice while avoiding his eyes. Will you help me move her? She asked, the question carrying layers of meaning beyond its surface simplicity. The process of relocating the yacht to a safer harbor required both of them to work together, their personal tensions temporarily set aside by the demands of seamanship. David took the helm while Elena handled the lines, their movements coordinated by years of experience, his with marine vessels, hers with this particular yacht. Sophie stood between them at the control station, her small hands resting on the wheel beside her father's larger ones. Look, Daddy, I'm driving the boat, she announced, her delight infectious. For a moment, the tension between the adults dissolved, replaced by shared amusement at Sophie's enthusiasm. You're doing great, sweetheart, David said, his voice warm with pride. Just keep her steady on this heading. The storm that night was fiercer than predicted, with winds that howled through the harbor and waves that crashed against the docks with frightening intensity. Elena lay in her cabin, listening to the yacht strain against her anchor lines and thinking about David and Sophie in their small apartment above the garage. She wondered if the building was sound enough to withstand the storm, if they had enough heat, if Sophie was frightened by the thunder that rolled across the harbor like cannon fire. At 2 a.m, unable to sleep, she pulled on a rain jacket and ventured onto the deck, checking the yacht's position and anchor lines. The harbor lights were dim through the driving rain, but she could make out the dark shape of David's building in the distance. When the storm passed and morning came, Elena found herself hurrying to the garage with unusual urgency. The building had weathered the storm well, but she needed to see with her own eyes that David and Sophie were safe. She found them in the garage, David working on a generator that had apparently failed during the night, Sophie coloring at a small table nearby. We lost power around midnight, David explained, not looking up from his work. Generator's been acting up for weeks. Should have replaced it sooner. Elena noticed the space heater plugged into an extension cord, the blanket wrapped around Sophie's shoulders, the thermos of what was probably cold coffee beside David's tools. Why didn't you call me? She asked. The yacht has a backup generator, heat, everything you need. David's hands stilled on the generator's engine, and when he looked up, his expression was a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Because this is our home, he said simply. We don't run away when things get difficult. Elena felt the rebuke in his words, understanding that he was talking about more than just the storm. I'm not running away, she said, but even as she spoke, she wasn't sure if it was true. Had she come to Milbrook to start over, or simply to hide? Was her growing attachment to David and Sophie genuine, or just another form of escape from the complicated reality of her life? Aren't you? David asked, his voice gentle but direct. You've been here for weeks, Elena. When are you planning to leave? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Elena realized she didn't have an answer. She had been living day to day, enjoying the simple routine of morning coffee and yacht maintenance, but she hadn't thought about the future. I don't know, she admitted, the honesty surprising them both. I haven't thought that far ahead. David nodded, turning back to his work. That's the difference between us, he said. I think about the future every day. Every decision I make is about what's best for Sophie in the long run, not just what feels good right now. Elena felt the criticism in his words, but she also heard something else, an invitation to prove him wrong, to show that she could be more than just a wealthy woman playing at ordinary life. The generator coughed to life, filling the garage with the steady hum of restored power. Sophie cheered, clapping her hands as the lights came back on. Daddy fixed it, she announced proudly. He always fixes everything. Elena watched David's face soften as he looked at his daughter, and she felt a stab of envy for the simple, uncomplicated love between them. Not everything, sweetheart, he said quietly. Some things can't be fixed. Elena understood that he was talking about his wife, about the life they had lost, about the choices that had brought him to this small garage in a coastal town. But some things can be made better, she said, surprising herself with the words. David looked at her, his expression unreadable. Can they? The answer came 3 days later, when Elena made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She found David in the garage, working on a boat engine while Sophie played nearby, and announced that she was staying in Milbrook permanently. "I'm buying a house," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "The Victorian on Harbor Street. It needs work, but it has a good foundation, and the view is beautiful," I thought. I thought maybe I could learn to live a different kind of life. David set down his wrench, studying her face with careful attention. "What about your world, your friends, your responsibilities?" Elena shrugged, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "What responsibilities? My entire life was built around my marriage, and that's over. As for friends," she trailed off, realizing that most of her relationships had been based on social convenience rather than genuine connection. "And what about us?" David asked, his voice so quiet that Elena almost missed the question. Sophie looked up from her coloring, sensing the importance of the moment. "What about us?" Elena echoed, her heart racing. David stepped closer, his work-roughened hands gentle as they framed her face. "You know what I mean," he said, "this thing between us. These feelings we've been dancing around for weeks." Elena's breath caught, amazed by his directness. "I was hoping," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that we could find out together." Sophie's voice broke the moment. "Are you and Elena going to get married?" she asked with the blunt curiosity of a 6-year-old. David and Elena looked at each other, then burst into laughter that held more promise than any words could have conveyed. The summer that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. She threw herself into the renovation of the Victorian house with the same intensity she had once brought to charity galas and board meetings. David helped with the electrical work and plumbing, his practical skills complementing her ambitious vision. Sophie appointed herself as supervisor, arriving each morning with her toy hard hat and clipboard, ready to inspect the day's progress. "The kitchen needs more windows," she announced one morning, studying Elena's renovation plans with serious consideration, "and maybe a special place for making cookies." Elena laughed, making notes on the blueprint. "An excellent suggestion. We'll definitely need a cookie-making station." The house slowly transformed under their combined efforts, becoming something none of them had expected, a home that reflected all three of their personalities. Elena's elegant taste merged with David's practical functionality and Sophie's whimsical touches. The kitchen featured professional-grade appliances alongside a child-height counter where Sophie could help with cooking. The living room had a reading nook with built-in bookshelves and a window seat that overlooked the harbor. David's workshop occupied the basement, filled with tools and workbenches where he could pursue his passion for fixing things. "It's like a real home," Sophie declared one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and crimson. Elena discovered that she had a talent for the mundane tasks of daily life: grocery shopping, school pickup, bedtime stories. She found herself looking forward to these simple routines more than she had ever enjoyed any social event or business meeting. "You're different," David observed one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "More relaxed, more yourself." Elena considered this, realizing that for the first time in years, she wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't trying to be the perfect wife, the ideal hostess, or the successful businesswoman. She was simply Elena, and somehow that was enough. "I think I'm learning who I actually am," she said, and David smiled. "I like who you're becoming." The first real test of their new life came when Elena's ex-husband appeared in Milbrook, accompanied by lawyers and threats of legal action. He had discovered the sabotage device that David had removed from the yacht and was now claiming that Elena had violated their divorce agreement by having it analyzed. "You always were too smart for your own good," he sneered, standing in the renovated kitchen like a dark reminder of Elena's past, playing house with the local handyman. "How long do you think this little fantasy will last?" Elena felt the familiar fear creep up her spine, the ingrained response to years of emotional manipulation. But then David stepped forward, his presence calm and steady. "I think you should leave," he said quietly. "Elena has nothing to say to you." The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of David's protective instincts and Elena's own growth over the past months. She stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated by legal threats or personal attacks. "You sabotaged my yacht," she said, her voice steady and clear. "You tried to trap me, to make me dependent on you even after our marriage was over. That device David found is evidence of criminal activity, and my lawyers are very interested in discussing it with you." Her ex-husband's confident facade cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath. You have no proof, he blustered, but Elena smiled, an expression that would have been cold if not for the warmth David's presence brought to her life. Actually, I do. David documented everything. Every wire, every connection, every piece of evidence that proves what you did. The legal battle that followed was swift and decisive. Elena's ex-husband, faced with evidence of his sabotage and the prospect of criminal charges, agreed to a settlement that left Elena free to live her life without further interference. "It's over," she told David as they sat on the yacht's deck, watching Sophie play with her sailing model. "Really over." David took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on her palm. "And what happens now?" he asked. Elena leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Now we figure out what comes next," she said. "Together." Sophie looked up from her toy boat, her face bright with excitement. "Can we take the big boat on an adventure?" she asked. "All three of us?" Elena and David exchanged glances, and Elena felt her heart expand with possibility. "I think that's an excellent idea," she said. The yacht's maiden voyage with her new crew was everything Elena had dreamed it would be. They sailed north along the coast, exploring hidden coves and secluded beaches, living simply and finding joy in each other's company. Sophie proved to be a natural sailor, her excitement infectious as she learned to tie knots and read the wind. David revealed another facet of his expertise, navigating by stars and instinct with the skill of someone who truly understood the sea. Elena found herself falling in love not just with David and Sophie, but with this new version of herself, someone who could find happiness in watching dolphins play in the yacht's wake, who could laugh at Sophie's silly jokes, who could sleep peacefully in David's arms as the boat rocked gently at anchor. One evening, as they sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sophie made an announcement that surprised them both. "I think Mommy would like Elena," she said, her voice matter of fact. "She would want Daddy to be happy." David's breath caught, and Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" Elena asked gently. Sophie shrugged, her 6-year-old wisdom startling in its simplicity. "Because you make him smile like he used to. Before Mommy got sick." David pulled both of them close, his voice thick with emotion. "Your Mommy loved you more than anything in the world," he told Sophie. "And she would want us to be happy, all of us." Elena felt the last of her walls crumble, understanding that she wasn't replacing Sarah, she was building something new with David and Sophie, something that honored the past while embracing the future. The wedding, when it came 6 months later, was everything Elena had never known she wanted. No elaborate ceremony, no hundreds of guests, no designer gown that cost more than most people's cars. Instead, they were married on the yacht's deck at sunset, with only Sophie and Mr. Thompson, the old harbor master who had become their friend, as witnesses. Elena wore a simple white dress that she had bought at a boutique in the nearby town, and David wore his best suit, the one he had worn to Sarah's funeral, now transformed into something hopeful. Sophie served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her role in the ceremony reflecting her importance in their new family. "Do you, Elena, take David to be your husband, to love and support him, to build a life together based on trust and mutual respect?" asked the minister. "I do," Elena said, her voice clear and strong. "And do you promise to love Sophie as your own daughter, to help raise her with kindness and wisdom?" "I do," Elena repeated, looking into Sophie's bright eyes. "I absolutely do." The reception was held in the renovated Victorian house, with neighbors and friends gathering to celebrate the union of 3 lives that had found each other against all odds. Elena looked around the room at David's easy smile as he talked with local fishermen who had become his friends, at Sophie dancing with other children from her school, at the simple decorations that reflected their shared taste rather than any designer's vision. "Regrets?" David asked, appearing at her elbow with a glass of champagne. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about the life she had left behind, the world of luxury and status that had once seemed so important. "None," she said, meaning it completely. "This is better than anything I could have imagined." The first year of marriage brought its own challenges and rewards. Elena learned to navigate the complexities of step-parenthood, finding her way through school projects and bedtime negotiations with patience she hadn't known she possessed. David gradually opened up about his life with Sarah, sharing memories that helped Elena understand the depth of his first love while making room for their new relationship. Sophie blossomed under the attention of 2 devoted parents, her natural curiosity and joy bringing light to their daily routines. "She's healing us," Elena observed one evening, watching Sophie teach David a new card game, just by being herself. The yacht became a symbol of their new life together, transformed from a symbol of Elena's failed marriage into a vessel for family adventures. They spent weekends exploring the coast, teaching Sophie to sail, discovering hidden beaches and quiet anchorages. David's knowledge of marine engineering proved invaluable as they upgraded and customized the boat to suit their needs. Elena found herself truly understanding the vessel for the first time, learning to read the wind and waves, to feel the boat's rhythm beneath her feet. "You're becoming a real sailor," David told her one afternoon as she successfully navigated through a tricky harbor entrance. "Sarah would have loved this," he added quietly. "She always said the sea was where she felt most alive." The second year brought news that changed everything again. Elena was pregnant. The discovery filled them with joy and terror in equal measure, as they contemplated expanding their unconventional family. Sophie was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a big sister, already making plans for teaching the baby to sail and swim. "Will you tell the baby about Mommy Sarah?" she asked Elena one evening as they looked through photo albums together. "Of course," Elena replied, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "Your mommy will always be part of our family story." David watched from the doorway, his expression a mixture of wonder and gratitude. "Are you scared?" Elena asked him later, as they lay in bed listening to the harbor sounds outside their window. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also more excited than I've been in years." The baby arrived on a clear September morning, as the first hints of autumn touched the New England coast. David held Elena's hand through the long labor, his steady presence anchoring her through the intensity of bringing new life into the world. Sophie waited in the hospital lobby with Mr. Thompson, practicing her big sister duties by reading to her sailing model. "It's a boy," David announced when he came to get them, his face radiant with joy. "A perfect, healthy boy." Sophie clapped her hands together, already planning all the things she would teach her new brother. "Can we name him after one of the boats?" she asked seriously. Elena laughed, exhausted but happy. "We'll think about it," she promised. They named him Samuel David Mitchell, after David's grandfather and the man who had become the anchor of their family. Sam proved to be an easy baby, content to sleep in his carrier while they worked on the yacht or played in the harbor. Sophie took her role as big sister seriously, always willing to help with feeding and diaper changes, singing him the lullabies that Sarah had once sung to her. "He looks like Daddy," she observed, studying the baby's face with the intensity of a scientist. "But he has Elena's eyes." David marveled at how quickly Sam became part of their rhythm, how naturally Elena had taken to motherhood, how Sophie had embraced her expanded role in the family. The third year brought a proposal that tested their commitment to their new life. A major marine engineering firm offered David a position as chief designer, with a salary that would have made them wealthy beyond their current dreams. The job was in California, far from Milbrook and the life they had built together. "It's an incredible opportunity," Elena said as they discussed the offer over dinner. "You could design systems for the most advanced vessels in the world." David looked around their kitchen, taking in the familiar details: Sophie's artwork on the refrigerator, Sam's high chair covered in baby food, the view of the harbor through the window. "But I'd have to leave this," he said quietly. "Leave the garage, the town, the life we've built here." The decision, when it came, surprised no one who really knew them. David turned down the offer, choosing instead to expand his garage into a full-service marine repair facility. Elena used her business experience to help him develop a plan that would serve the growing yachting community along the coast while maintaining the personal touch that had made him successful. "We're not running away from opportunities," Elena explained to a friend who questioned their choice. "We're creating our own." The expanded business thrived, employing several local mechanics and establishing David as one of the premier marine engineers in the region. Sophie became the unofficial mascot of the business, greeting customers and helping with simple tasks after school. The harbor that had once seemed like a place of exile became the center of a rich, full life. Elena volunteered at Sophie's school, served on the town council, and discovered talents she had never known she possessed. David found a balance between his technical skills and his desire to build something lasting for his family. Sophie grew into a confident, capable child who moved easily between the world of boats and engines and the world of homework and friendships. Sam took his first steps on the yacht's deck, spoke his first words in the garage, and seemed destined to inherit his father's intuitive understanding of how things worked. 5 years after that first morning when Elena had challenged David to fix her boat, they stood together on the dock, watching the sunset paint the harbor in familiar shades of gold and crimson. The yacht, now truly theirs in every sense, bobbed gently at her mooring, ready for weekend adventures with the family of 4 who had found each other in the most unexpected way. Sophie, now 11 and tall for her age, was teaching 4-year-old Sam to tie proper sailing knots, her patience with her little brother reflecting the love that had shaped their unusual family. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been so arrogant that first day?" Elena asked, leaning against David's shoulder. "If I hadn't challenged you to fix my boat?" David considered the question, his arm tightening around her waist. "I think we would have found each other eventually," he said. "Some things are meant to be." Elena smiled, remembering the anger and desperation that had driven her to Milbrook, the loneliness that had made her lash out at a stranger who had simply been trying to help his daughter. "Sophie was right, she said. "You really can fix anything." David laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Not everything," he said, "but the important things. The things that matter most. Those we can fix together." As if summoned by their conversation, Sophie looked up from her knot-tying lesson, her face bright with the easy happiness of a child who had never doubted that she was loved. "Daddy, Elena, come see." Sam tied his first bowline. They walked hand in hand toward their children, toward the future they had built from the wreckage of their separate pasts, toward the life that had begun with a challenge and a soggy paper boat. The story of how Elena Whitmore learned to love again, how David Mitchell rediscovered hope, and how Sophie and Sam grew up believing that any problem could be solved with patience, skill, and the right kind of love, became part of Milbrook's folklore. But for the family who lived it, it was simply Tuesday evening in the harbor, with the smell of salt air and the sound of children's laughter carrying across the water, and the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful things in life begin with the simple words, "My daddy fixes everything."